the fact that life is a little busy here going into the holidays for all of us. We are probably going to finish up at the end of this week, but maybe not too early next week now. And I'm extremely busy during this lame duck session. We've got about a dozen different legislative measures that we're working on trying to get done. As you know, the energy bill has still not been completed. This is one that I've spent a lot of time and effort on, really 6 years on the energy efficiency bill that is part of this, the Portman-Shaheen bill. And then also our National Park Centennial Act is within the energy bill. So we are working hard to try to get that legislation to the floor of the Senate for a vote. We know it'll pass with a comfortable margin if we can do that and get it to the President for a signature. The Cures Act is coming up for a vote. It's a good bill. It advances a lot of reforms to help speed the delivery of life-saving medical cures. I support it. It's also got about $1 billion increase in opioid funding over 2 years, $500 million a year that I strongly support, and I appreciate the fact that Chairman Alexander was willing to work with me to help get that in the legislation. Although I did fight for our ability to offer amendments to cures, I'm disappointed they wouldn't allow amendments. Mine would have been to help save the pensions and health care benefits of thousands of retired coal miners in Ohio. I'm sorry we weren't able to get that included in cures. I support the underlying bill, and again, I intend to vote for it. The legislation also includes a number of legislative initiatives that I've championed in the Senate to strengthen Medicare and Medicaid. I spoke about those specifics last week. If anybody's interested in following up on that, please let me know. I co-authored legislation that is part of the National Defense Authorization Act that is also in the balance that I'm excited about getting done. The NDA will probably be voted on tomorrow or maybe the next day. It passed the House last Friday. The legislation I'm talking about would require the Air Force to submit a strategy for modernizing the C-130H aircraft that we currently have at the Youngstown Air Reserve Station. And this is an important step to getting to the new C-130J models that they need and they deserve. Also in that legislation, the NDA, by the way, we got our legislation again called Countering Disinformation and Propaganda Act. This I co-authored with Senator Murphy, and it's designed to help American allies by countering foreign governments that use propaganda, countries like Russia, China, other nations. And I'm hopeful that legislation will really make a difference in terms of getting the U.S. government up to speed and bring us into the 21st century in terms of responding to disinformation. Also in that NDA legislation, we got key elements of our Ukraine security assistance legislation. This has to do with helping Ukraine defend itself. It's got $350 million authorized in security assistance, including lethal and non-lethal equipment, training and technical assistance. It's tied to some reforms, which I think are important also, but the key thing is it allows Ukraine to be able to defend itself. And particularly as the new administration comes in, it's important to pass this authorization and ensure that the people of Ukraine know that we're standing with them. This builds on some provisions that I got included in last year's defense authorization bill. And then finally, the NDA's got language for Lima. Some of you follow closely what's going on at the Lima Tank Plant. That's the Joint Systems Manufacturing Center. And this has $1 billion in funding for the Abrams tank upgrades and also for Stryker armored vehicles, both of which are made at the Lima Tank Plant. This is really important to be able to add jobs to the plant and strengthen the Lima tank plant going into the future. It's exciting because this plant was one that the Obama administration wanted to shut down. Now it's seeing new life, and this legislation will help to ensure that continues. There's also a bill that is going to be passed, I believe. It's still not quite done, which is the Water Resources Development Act. And WRDA, as you know, is focused on federal water projects, and this year it contains legislation that I authored that is really important to Cleveland because it keeps the Cuyahoga River open for commercial use, but also keeps the Corps from dumping dredge in Lake Erie. This says that the Army Corps has to comply with state water quality standards. It means that it would prevent them from dumping unless Ohio EPA were to agree to it, which they are not agreeing to. So this is very important for us and for being sure that Cleveland is protected. also includes legislation in the Word bill that I co-authored that authorizes the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative at $300 million a year. This $300 million a year is $50 million more than the President Obama request, and it's really important for the lake. We're using that funding already, and this reauthorization is important to ensure that funding can continue. It's used to protect Lake Erie, which is, of course, a treasure for Ohio. It's also used to reduce the phosphorus loading into Lake Erie, which contributes to the harmful algal blooms. So this is important legislation to keep Lake Erie that treasure that it is. WRDA also includes bipartisan compromise legislation to provide $170 million for states to address lead in our water supply. It also improves all forms of water infrastructure and funds health programs to treat lead exposure. Among other things, it requires the EPA to notify the public of toxic lead levels within 15 days of being detected. A lot of this comes out of what happened in Flint, Michigan, of course, and it's called the Flint Water Crisis Bill. But it's really broader than that because it applies to water systems all over the country, including Ohio. And one reason I got involved in putting together this bipartisan compromise, along with Senator Stabenow, Senator Inhofe, and Senator Peters, and the reason I supported it as one of the two Republicans was because I wanted to be sure it was more broadly applicable than just for Flint, Michigan. And it is, and it'll help us in Ohio. We've got a number of lead water issues in Ohio, and so I'm excited about that legislation getting done. WRDA also includes my language requiring the Army Corps to conduct a study on the final flood control, the ecosystem restoration, and the recreation components of the Riverfront Park in Cincinnati. Some of you follow this. This will provide an additional $30 million if, as we expect, this study determines that the components are feasible. We've done this before. This would be the final federal match to complete the Banks project on the Ohio River, that beautiful park that you see now, which is the front door to Cincinnati. And we're happy to get that included as well. Finally, it's got the legislation that I wrote called the Great Lakes Fish and Wildlife Restoration Act that authorizes Fish and Wildlife Service to partner with other federal agencies, states, and so on to help restore fish and wildlife resources in the Great Lakes Basin. So there's a lot of priorities in there for us. We're happy we're done. This will be a big victory for Ohio. We've got other priorities we're also working on. Obviously, one is the prompt implementation and full funding for CARA. That's the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act. The President signed it into law over the summer. We're now working hard to get it fully implemented. Some provisions have been implemented already, others have not. We got a $37 million down payment for CARA in the short-term CR. We've got to be sure we finish the job and fully fund CARA, and any continuing resolution we vote on here, and that is one that we expect to vote on here in the next couple of days, just complements what is in the CURES bill we talked about earlier, which is 2 years of block grants directly to states. CARA is legislation that is intended to change the way the funding is used to focus on evidence-based programs we know works for not just prevention and treatment, but also longer-term recovery, and also helping our law enforcement folks and other provisions. So we're trying to get this all done, and if we do, we will make great progress toward addressing the heroin and prescription drug epidemic, and the combination of CARA and the CURES Act. I think we'll truly be able to say this is beginning now to get the federal government to the point where we're partners as appropriate with state, local government, and nonprofits to begin to turn the tide on this terrible epidemic that's hit Ohio as hard as any other state. Anyway, it's busy. We've got a few days left in this Congress, and we'll continue to work hard to deliver results. Questions or comments?
Senator Steve Koff, real quickly on there, because I got a lot of questions, so I'll be real fast. On the WRDA bill, on the portion having to do with dredging of Cleveland Harbor, as you probably know, the Corps of Engineers and the Ohio EPA reached a settlement not too long ago where the Corps is going to do what the Ohio EPA wants, but whoever is going to pay for that will be determined later by a lawsuit. Does this legislation deal with that lawsuit issue, or who's going to pay at all?
No, it doesn't. But what it does do is it puts into law that the Army Corps has to comply with those state water quality standards, and that puts Ohio EPA in the driver's seat. So it is consistent with the way that lawsuit was settled, but it keeps that lawsuit from being an issue going forward, that Ohio EPA would have to certify. And as you know, their position is they will not certify because they believe the PCB level is too high. I do too. So do the people of Cleveland, as you know.
Right. On the continuing resolution, which we haven't seen yet, what do you expect to be in it for Ohio?
Well, a lot, because it has all the funding, the federal government. And specifically, what I was able to get in last time was a down payment on CARA. As you know, CARA is like $181 million a year in additional funding. And so we wanted to be sure that we got that fully funded. The other big thing for me, Steve, that I didn't talk about this week, but I talked about it previously, is Piketon. As you know, there was a proposal from the administration not to fund the cleanup. We would have had, I think, about 700 people lose their jobs about now, just before Christmas. We were able to keep that going in the last CR, keep the cleanup dollars coming, so we weren't having to lay off all these people. We have that in this next continuing resolution too. We expect, that's what we expect, and I'm confident that there will be good language in there for Piketon, but it's critical to have that done. If it is not done, you have several hundred people who lose their jobs, and so that's important. But, this is not the best way to legislate because this is a continuing resolution, meaning that it funds last year's funding, basically, and it doesn't have new starts, it doesn't have, the kind of oversight that you'd expect. So really, all of the federal government for the next few months, it goes for 4 months until March, will be included in this. And we were able to get some of these, what they call exceptions or anomalies. One is certainly CARA, which was not in last year's bill. So that's one of the few anomalies in the legislation. And then the Piketon funding is also really important to ensure that we are not having these people lose their jobs. The reason Piketon is necessary is in part because the price of uranium has gone down. So what we did last year is not adequate to cover the expense of the cleanup.
And I know you don't like CRs. You've voted against them in the past. Will you vote against this one?
We'll see. We'll see. I do have a lot of good things in here, and I think it's a terrible way to govern. I think you should do appropriations bills, and hopefully we'll get back to that in March. I was not supportive of us, pushing this off till March, to be frank with you. I thought we shouldn't do another CR, and rather we should have done an appropriation bill this week. But I was overruled by, I think, both parties and by the new administration.
Right. They're talking April, by the way, now. Late April.
Okay, yeah, so maybe a little more than 4 months.
Senator Jeff Portman, do you expect to have all $181 million for this year in the continuing resolution? And also, can you talk a little bit about whether or not the Pension and Miners Protection Act might be tucked into the CR?
Yeah, I should have mentioned that in the context of the CR to respond to Steve's question. We believe that we are in pretty good shape to get health care coverage into the CR for these miners. Remember, there's a urgent issue, which is that at the end of this year, a number of people, we think it's about 20,000, would lose their health care coverage. And that's a huge issue that's immediate for these families. So at a minimum, I expect that will be successful in the CR. I certainly hope so. We'd like to have the broader pension bill included as well. That's still a fight, and we're fighting the good fight as we tried to on the Cures bill. But I think we will, at a minimum, be able to get something in there to ensure that these retired miners are not going to face a big spike in their health care costs. What was your first question? Yes?
Yeah, my first question had to do with all $181 million. Is that what you're expecting?
Yeah, I mean, the CARA, this is, if it goes until April, then maybe it's 7 months of the year, so it would be the equivalent of 7 months worth of funding is what we expect. We'll have to fight the good fight again, in March or April for the remaining part of the year. But it's adequate funding, in fact, more than adequate to begin the implementation because, as you can imagine, the rollout takes a while. And right now what we're trying to do is expedite the implementation by the administration. 2 of the programs have already been implemented. There are about 5 or 6 others that we're hoping will be implemented soon, and we have plenty of funding for that. So that's been my real push with our team, is to say, to Republicans and Democrats alike, don't give the administration an excuse not to implement this legislation. Give them more than enough funding to be able to get it moving. One example is that they have now allowed, put out the regulations to allow physicians' assistants and some nurses who couldn't previously do it, nurse practitioners, to be able to administer medication in the context of a treatment program. That's really important to a lot of Ohio treatment centers, and it expands their reach and lowers their costs significantly. That's now done. So those regulations have been promulgated. They're out. That's an example of what we want to get moving quickly on.
And how does it, just one last thing, how does it dovetail with the $1 billion towards opioid that will be increased?
Doesn't the $1 billion from the Cures Act have to be appropriated then going into next year?
Yeah, well, here's how it works. It's $500 for this year and $500 for next year, and so it's only for 2 years, Steve, rather than an authorization which is a longer-term authorization. And as you know, with authorizations, they tend to continue pretty much indefinitely. So it goes directly to the states as block grants, and I know that Ohio will use it well because I know how Ohio intends to use it. I wish there had been more flexibility in this money for recovery. That's the one comment that I made in my floor speech last week, and we tried to get that changed, but others felt differently about it. But for prevention, treatment, it's needed money. It goes right to the states right now, and the states determine.
Now, it doesn't have to wait until next year's appropriations.
No, it doesn't. And we can give you the detail on that as to why it's like an advance appropriation. That may not be technically the right term. I'll send you information on that. But it's just 2 years, whereas the authorization under the CARA Act, for which you do have to fight for appropriations every year, changes the way the money is spent. It's not a block grant. It sends money, for instance, to the kind of prevention and treatment programs and longer-term recovery programs that based on the evidence, based on the research that we did, we believe work better. So you have to apply within certain standards as an organization. It doesn't have to go through the state. So both of them are important. Stemming the tide right now is important. That's why I think the block grants are important. That's why I push for that, to just get the money out immediately. Remember, we had this debate on the floor. But it's also important to put in place this longer-term funding that should be there year after year after year, that focuses and targets the kinds of, whether it's prevention or treatment or longer-term recovery, that we believe is based on best practices from around the country that works best. So I don't think that answers your question entirely, but it's two different pots of money, but they're complementary, and given the epidemic that we face and the urgency of it, I think both are needed.
Thank you.
Rob Davis Coleman with the Indicator.
Hey, Dave, how are you?
Good. The NDAA with the C-130Js for ERs.
Very important because it prioritizes this over other projects. They've got a lot of modernization projects, and it says to them, this is the intent of Congress to modernize these aircraft at these air bases. I can give you the exact numbers later, but it's something like, 7 air bases in the entire country, maybe fewer, that are affected by this. So this is not something that applies broadly. It applies to air bases, and I think it may be fewer than 7, where they have a specialized mission. And the specialized mission, as you know, is the not just the air cargo mission, which it has, but also the spraying mission. That's what makes us special. And so our focus in this is, what was the best way, short of an earmark, which is not legal, to get the funding into the kinds of specialized missions that we have at Youngstown in order to modernize the fleet? Because, as you know, the fleet's really 2-3 generations old. And you and I talked about this before, about how they have to have a machine shop there that I've visited in order to make the parts, because the parts aren't available anymore now. That's partly for the spraying equipment, which is also antiquated, but it's partly for the aircraft itself is antiquated. So for the safety of the pilots and just for the efficiency of the mission, they need these new aircraft, and this will prioritize us as compared to other modernization projects.
So how long?
Senator, this is Deirdre from the Enquirer. Do you have
Hey, David?
Yeah.
If you don't mind, I will have Don give you a call, or Tyler, and just walk you through some of the specifics of it and what they think the Air Force will now do with this, because that's what's really important in terms of timing.
Senator, this is Deirdre from the Enquirer. I have 2 questions. First, do you have any concerns about any of the cabinet nominees that President-elect Trump has named so far? I mean, you've got a good number of folks out there, and some
some are generating more controversy than others. Can you just talk about the names you've seen so far, what your feeling is? And then second, you said you know how Ohio is going to spend the money in the tiers bill. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, with regard to the nominees, I probably don't know all of them off the top of my head, but I'm impressed with a number of them. One, as you know, I know very well, is Elaine Chao. She was my favorite cabinet member when I was at OMB because she would come to me and say, how can the Department of Labor spend less money, as opposed to every other cabinet member who would come and say, you know, we need X amount more money, which was hard to do when we were trying to do a balanced budget, which we were then. But she's also a good administrator. She's got that experience at the Department of Labor, also a lot of private sector experience in the nonprofit area and the for-profit area. So I think she'll be very strong. I know some of the other cabinet members better than others. I don't know General Mattis well, but I know him to be a person who has a really good reputation across the board. My military legislative assistant, who you know, Don, used to report directly to him, for instance, and has very high regard for him as, you know, in terms of his character and his intelligence. He's a very thoughtful guy. So I'm excited about Mattis. Trying to think of who else has been nominated recently.
Ben Carson, Betsy DeVos.
I don't know them.
Sessions.
Well, I do know Betsy DeVos. I know about her work with regard to school choice and, you know, trying to help underprivileged kids be able to get good educational opportunities. I think she's a good pick for that reason. Who was the other one you mentioned?
Ben Carson.
I've met him. I don't know him well, but, you know, he has a passion for this area, and I think he'll do a good job. He has personal experience with regard to government housing and has ideas about how to make, you know, the government housing and the subsidies work better to provide more opportunity and that sort of thing. So I think these are all promising picks. Ultimately, decisions on policy are made by the White House and the administration. So not that the cabinet members aren't important, but having been, you know, worked in two White Houses, the first Bush White House where I was in the West Wing, and then the second Bush White House where I was OMB and USTR. I mean, most important is the policy coming from the administration.
And the second question about how will Ohio use the money in the cures bill for opioid,
okay.
and do you have a sense of how much they could get, or the state could get?
You know, I do have a number in my head, but it may not be accurate. But we've been in discussions with some of the people in Ohio who are really excited about this. Obviously, we've been working with them for years, both, you know, in the previous administration and this administration with the Drug-Free Communities Act. So, David?
Yeah.
Some are generating more.
One, as you know, I know very well, is Elaine Chao. She was my favorite cabinet member when I was at OMB because she would come to me and say, how can the Department of Labor spend less money, as opposed to every other cabinet member who would come and say, you know, we need... Having to hear me twice, this is terrible. This is hard.